Back to Gaza now and the gulf that exists in the coverage of this story inside and outside Israel. Usually, Israeli journalism is what good journalism should be. It's thorough, investigative, and robust. However, the military censors wield considerable power, and when they step in, the journalism suffers. Like all Israeli citizens, Israeli journalists are banned by law from going to Gaza. The only way they've made it in on this story is when they're embedded with Israeli army units, and embeds only get a narrow view. Israeli media consumers do have access to global media through satellite or digital distribution, but you have to go looking for those news sources, and most people just don't bother. They use media produced at home, which makes the work of the one Palestinian journalist in Gaza for an Israeli newspaper worth looking at. The Listening Post's Will Young now on the domestic coverage of the Gaza war in Israel and how journalists in Gaza try to get their story to the rest of the world.
Not every journalist has to travel far from home to cover the biggest news stories in the world. Sometimes the news comes to them. Abeer Ayyoub is a Palestinian whose home and beat is Gaza. Her job as a journalist is to report on life and death there to her readers on the other side of the border in Israel.
I was raised up in a conflict zone. Since I was a child, I was following on what's going on TV, on newspapers, on radios. So I was inspired by what's happening on my homeland. So I decided to be a journalist, and my main focus is the Israeli media outlets. It's my mission and my part to tell people in Israel what's going on in Gaza, because people there are misled by what they see on their media. They know only what's going on in Israel.
Israel's media, increasingly influenced by voices from the political right, have little airtime or column space for opposition to the Gaza war, which Israelis, according to polls, support in overwhelming numbers. The Haaretz Daily, which publishes Ayyoub's work, is rare among Israeli media outlets in that it gives room to the counter-narrative. That's much harder to find in papers like Israel Hayom, Yediot Ahronot, and the Jerusalem Post, none of which have correspondents in Gaza.
We're an Israeli newspaper, we're a Zionist newspaper, so we're reporting from that angle what's happening, how this war is affecting Israel. I don't think we need to apologize for that. It's a complicated situation because we are not allowed into Gaza. We have reporters on the border in Gaza. We had a reporter go into Gaza to see one of the tunnels that Hamas has built. We have reporters that chase pretty much every code red siren that goes off within the country.
Embedding with Israeli soldiers, trailing tanks heading into the war zone. These are the only legal ways under Israeli law for an Israeli journalist to enter Gaza. However, the army does not take embedded journalists into the schools, hospitals and homes levelled by Israel's airstrikes and artillery. And if those journalists can't see that side of the story, neither will their audiences.
The Israeli media focuses almost entirely of a country at war, and everything is dominated by the military. And Hamas is described as a terrorist organization against the background of rocket attacks from the Gaza Strip into Israel. There is an atmosphere of war in which Israel is engaged, and that's how it sees the story.
The Israeli government has a control in its media. Journalists there are not free to write whatever they want because the security concern is very important. So I think it's very important to be a part of the conflict and also reporting about the conflict.
While Dahdur, another Gazan, is a correspondent for Al Jazeera Arabic. Just prior to this interview, his home was hit by an Israeli missile. Al Jazeera's office in Gaza, where Dahdur is based, was also fired upon. He and his team were some of the first reporters to reach Shuja'iyeh, one of Gaza's most densely populated neighborhoods, when it came under Israeli assault in the early days of the fighting.
Ours was the only team that managed to get on air immediately and broadcast live from Shuja'iyeh despite the difficulties and danger. While we were reporting, the shelling seemed to follow us and 2 rockets hit the house in front of us. We were targeted 3 times nearby by airstrikes and tank shelling. We were the only reporters there and we had to work through continuous shelling.
كيف تركت حي الشجاعية؟
The moment when I heard the question, when my colleague asked me my impressions, what I had seen and how I left the Shuja'iyya district, I told her what we saw as we left. Piles of bodies, women too. I couldn't control myself and began to cry. We have witnessed 2 wars before this. There was a lot of blood and violence. But this destruction, these horrific images of injuries and martyrs, this waterfall of blood, this we had not seen before.
Journalists like to maintain a facade, one that presents them as immune to the emotions of the story. But there's something about this Gaza war that affected not only local reporters, but international journalists as well. Jon Snow anchors the news for Britain's Channel 4, a terrestrial broadcaster. In late July, after returning from Gaza, he strayed from the normal, dispassionate script, and the video found an audience, going viral.
What I saw is still etched in my mind.
Jon Snow's YouTube report was an extremely powerful piece of television, but he was utterly in control of his emotions. He wasn't weeping. He was very cool, very calm, and extremely articulate.
In some way, we actually share some responsibility.
I've seen some interviews that Jon Snow has conducted with Israeli government representatives, and I think he's totally unprofessional, and he takes a side.
There are grave uncertainties about whether you are acting within the law.
I disagree.
Yes. Oh, yes.
There's definitely a side to the foreign media which sees the Palestinians and Hamas as the underdog without focusing on the big picture. Media organizations give these reports without mentioning why Israel is bombarding Gaza and how this is a defensive war that Israel has undertaken.
For anyone watching the global media, it's impossible to ignore the facts, the numbers, the Palestinian civilian casualties, children dying in the hundreds. Israel's government may be losing control of the media narrative beyond its borders, but by banning all Israelis, including journalists, from going to Gaza, it still effectively controls much of what Israelis see and read in their own media.
We are reliant on the IDF for information. They give briefings, many times a day. Our military correspondent is writing his stories based on those briefings. We don't have independent ways to corroborate those facts about the number of terrorists killed, the number of tunnels uncovered.
And with Israel's journalists relying on the army for information, the same army they've served in, Israeli audiences are not well served. Palestinians and the journalists in Gaza live in another world. Theirs is a different story.
The fact that we are Palestinians covering news in Palestine and that we have family, relatives and neighbors here is a double-edged sword. It motivates us because our coverage is related to our families and neighbors when they are targeted or their homes are hit with missiles. I want to say that a Palestinian journalist can combine being a Palestinian and working in the media.
I'm a Palestinian and I'm covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I'm still neutral and I'm trying to be professional as much as I can. We Palestinians here, we should learn the language and work out by ourselves to the international media, because we are a part of the story. We know what's going on. We have been living here for decades, and it's very important to have the Palestinian voice on the international media.